Hey, welcome back to already the fifth part of rebuilding Linea's website. And in this part, we are finally gonna rebuild the command menu. And although it looks like a command menu, the JavaScript behind it will be rather simple, because if we go to Linea's website and we scroll down to the command bar component, what you see actually is that this component contains a search bar which you can focus and then you can type into, and that will actually narrow down the current options that are there. And as soon as you click one option, it shows new options. And if you then choose another option from that sublist, it will just go back to its original state. So this is the component that we will be building today. If you're new to this series, we actually had 4 episodes of this series before. In the previous episode, linked up here, we built the keyboard shortcut component, and in all of the other previous episodes, we built all of the components above as well. So definitely check out the links in the description or go to the very first episode linked up here. And without further ado, let's start building this command bar component. So if we quickly switch over to what we have built so far, we see that for this command menu component, we only put in some text and a placeholder container. We can find the component for this section in components, sections, and then unlike any tool. And then you see that there's 4 different components here that represent all of these sections. And at the far bottom, there is a pretty empty section reserved for this command menu. So for this command menu component, I suggest that we create a new component inside the components directory called command menu.tsx. And from here, we export a component called command menu. And this component we will then add right underneath the text. And if we quickly switch back to Linea's website, I suggest that first we start with making this container with the input field and the label on top. So that means that we switch back to the command menu component and then inspect this element to see what its border radius is. And we see that the border radius actually is 8 pixels. And that 8 pixels is our rounded large class. And next to that, it also has a background that's transparent white. We have a color that's almost the same opacity called transparent white in our Tailwind config. So we're actually going to use that. So that means that we can add BG transparent white. And it also has a border of exactly the same color. So that also means that we have a border and then border transparent white. Then we need to make it full width. And for now, I'm going to give it padding, which probably will remove later, but that way at least I can see a little bit better what we're doing. Next is that there's also some distance from the top. And while I was looking for the correct margin they applied between the text and the command bar component, I actually noticed that they used position absolute to position this command bar. At first, I was doubting a little bit if it would be smart to also implement it in the same way, because position absolute always makes positioning a lot harder. So if I don't need it, I prefer not to do it. But then I started to play around a little bit with its command bar. And what I, for example, did is you see it here is I actually selected change priority, but then closed the menu bar again. And what you notice is that it's actually overflowing the wrapper component. If we would not absolutely position this, that would probably resize the wrapper and make it grow. So I think it is indeed the best option to go at position absolute here, because that way we fully have control over how this is positioned. It will ignore the padding and we can simply add an overflow hidden to this wrapper component. So the command bar also won't be visible outside of this wrapper. So that means that I'm going to add position absolute. And let's just start with a top 0 and a left of 0 and see from there. Of course, when we do this, I guess it's gone. And that is because our wrapper is not position relative. So currently is absolutely positioned towards the first relative parent, which could be anything and probably is the document itself. So it's flowing somewhere up in the top left of the page. So what we need to do for that is also add a relative to our component. So that way you immediately see it becomes absolute to its parent. And now we made this position absolute, our full width also doesn't apply anymore. So looking at Linear's website, you see that they gave it a width of 90 viewport width, as well as a max width of 640 pixels. And if we quickly switch to mobile, you see the reason why they used 90 viewport width instead of 90%. That is because the component actually becomes slightly larger than its wrapper block on mobile. And this way it overflows on the right and it probably looks just a little bit better. So we are gonna stick with exactly the same. That means that we're gonna add width of 19 viewport width, as well as a max width of 46 rem. And then of course we still need to position it in the right place. So that means that we're gonna put it in the center first, which is top half and left half. And doing that puts the top left of the component exactly in the center. However, we wanna have the full component in the center. And there's actually a really neat trick you can use for that. And that is using translate x of minus 50%. Watch the minus here. And do the same thing for the y-axis. Also, that also uses minus 50% as its value. So what that does is it positions it at the top left corner 50-50%, but then it moves the component half of its own width, 50%, back to the left, which makes the 50-50 of the top and left become the center. And then it does the same thing for the y-axis to also move it halfway up, which actually results in that the component is exactly in the middle. So now we have that out of the way, we also should make sure that the text is at the top instead of the bottom, because by default, we've built these blocks in a way that the content is always pushed towards the bottom. And if we look at our component, we can see how we have achieved that. And that is by adding this justify end. So if we change that to justify start, it will move the content to the start. And the command menu will stay in the center because it's absolutely positioned. So it will ignore any flex positioning. So before tweaking the positioning anymore, I first want to make sure that we add some content to this command menu, because that way positioning will become a bit easier. So again, if we look at Linear's website, we see that there's a label on top, then there's an input field as well as those buttons. So let's start with that. First, I'm gonna add a span, which will get the ticket number and ticket name. Then we have an input field, which perhaps later will become a form. And then we have a div with all of the different buttons. So if we go back, we see that it looks pretty ugly. First things first, what should happen is that everything should be rendered as a flex column, because everything is in one column. So the easiest way is to also add flex as well here. And next to flex, also make it a flex column. And we're going to do the same thing for the button wrapper. So this way also all of the buttons are rendered as columns. Then we can also say item start to align everything to the left. And then we're gonna add some proper styling. First, let's have a look at this label. It has a background that's white and also has a transparency of 95%. And since we currently have the background transparent white, but that's 0.1%, we cannot reuse that because otherwise you wouldn't see the difference between the background of the command bar and this label. So for this, we're going to use an arbitrary value to generate this style. We can use that by using background white and then add a slash, which already suggests some of the transparency values. If we, for example, would use 50, it would be 50%. However, there is no 0.05%. 5% is the lowest we have. But for this, we can use an arbitrary value with the square brackets. in there we can write 0.05 and then close the square bracket. And if we then go back to our own rebuild, you see that this generates a custom class with the transparency we want. What I also quickly want to do is check what the right font size is, because everything is so small now that you don't see things like the background and stuff very well. I see that, for example, for the buttons, they use a font size of 14 pixels, which is our text small. And for the input field, they use a font size of 18 pixels, and that is our text large. And finally, for the label, they have a font size of 12 pixels, which is our text extra small. Now back to this label to finish what we were working on. This label has a padding of 8 pixels on the x-axis, but you also see that there's a little bit of room on the top and the bottom, and they did actually achieve that by adding some line height. So we can use this in a similar way by first adding the padding on the x-axis of 2, which is 8 pixels, then also adding a leading of 6, which equals 24 pixels, which is fairly similar to what Linear uses. And I'm a big proponent of using the variables that you have at hand instead of making a really custom value like this. Also, what we're still lacking is using the right color. And for this, again, they're using a custom white value. So we're also going to use a custom transparent white, which we can do by adding text white and then /50 to have the 50% opacity. The next thing is the input field. And you see that this field, of course, doesn't have any background. So let's start with adding background transparent. And also add the correct placeholder text. And while we're at it, also look at the padding they added to it, which is 20 pixels. So that means they have a padding of 5 all around. And that also brings us to the point where we should remove the margin around the sides of this component, because the margin, or actually the padding, is now given by the input field itself. Of course, you could still think that this container has a padding on its own because all of the components are inset. However, that's not the case for these buttons. So that would mean that either the label and the input field would be in its own container that has a padding. That could be an option. Or you need to negatively offset these buttons to make sure that they extend the full width. So I think the approach the Linear team took to not give this component any padding, so all of the buttons extend the full width, is probably the right one in this case. So I'm also going to remove the padding we added in the beginning, which means that in a second we also need to add some margin to our label probably. Yes, right away. So that means that this label now has a margin left of 5. So it's on the same position as the input field. And let's see what margin top it has. It has a margin top of 8. Oh, and I see they used 16 pixels as a margin. So that means margin left of 4 and margin top of 2. Next is also make sure that this input is a full width and has no outline. This way, when we focus it, you will not see the ugly blue outline anymore. And now I'm looking at this component, I also see that this label actually does not have the correct line height. We added the leading of 6, which by default maps to 1.5 REM, and by default is 24 pixels in Tailwind's configuration. But since we changed our REMs to be 10, this is actually now 15 pixels. So that means that we should update our leading to a value that's close to 2.4 REM. And then it's actually a leading of 10. So I also updated that, and that makes the label already look quite a bit better. Let's also give these buttons a bit of a padding. They also have a padding of 20. So I'm gonna add it to 1, which is padding of 5. And also already take a look at the color. And that color actually maps to our off-white color variable. So it also gets text off-white. And we can actually add this text to the wrapper so this way we don't need to repeat it on all of its children. Okay, and now we have done this. I actually don't want to add this padding class to all of the buttons, so I'm gonna make a small array of options, and that array contains all of these 4 items. But as soon as you click one item, you get new options, and then you go back. But if you click another one, they all have like these child options. So for now, I'm gonna structure it in a way that you have a main array with these 4 items, but they also have sub options, which are those 4. And if you select one of the parents, then it shows its sub items. So let's create an array called command options. In there, we get an object, and you already see that Copilot again is smart enough to know that I want to abstract this button in there. So let's do that and see what Copilot suggests next. Yeah, a value. That could be the case, of course, if you really want to make this dynamic. But for now, this is pretty much the only thing we need. There will also be an icon we have in a second, which are all of the different icons that are in front of the options. And that icon will probably be a React component. It will be an SVG, which we will import in a second. And next to that, we also have the sub options, which is also an array. And that array, again, has a similar nested object, although it does not have sub options anymore. So let's first pull in the options of assign2, which is label Yori and icon, which is empty for now. I'm also quickly going to do the same thing for all the other options. So that's that. You also might have noticed that I did not add this array inside my component. And the reason for that is because it's never going to change. So there's no reason to let React constantly, when this component re-renders, recreate that object. And I know React is pretty smart in when it needs to set up new variables and things like that. But if it's not going to change, just leave it outside of the component. As soon as you have a really big application, this definitely will improve your performance. The other thing I still need to do is add in all of these icons. So let me also quickly get all of those. Okay, so that was quite a work, but that brought in all of the different icons. One exception is for the label icon. I created a small component that actually renders a div, and that div simply has a specific background color based on the type we pass in. And the reason I don't dynamically create the class name in here, but have this mapping object, is because Tailwind checks your code to extract certain class names during build. So it expects a full class name to be available right in your code instead of something that's concatenated together with JavaScript, because it cannot guess what that class name would be. So it would not put that class name in the build. Therefore, it's important that the class names are always fully written out instead of concatenated. And now we have all of these different icons rendered as well. We can finally loop through the array instead of writing 25 buttons. So let's start first by rendering the top level buttons so we can at least finish styling all of these buttons. Let's map through them and then render the same button again, which had a padding of 5. And then in there we render the button.label, and we also should render the button icon. And while doing this, I see that the button.icon is complaining. It says that it sometimes can return void. And the reason is because I forgot to add one specific icon in. So let's do that, and that will solve this error. But I also don't really like having a lowercase variable that actually is a JSX component, because the best practice for React components is to always have their name start with a capital. So what I actually want to do is I want to destructure this button into a label and icon. That would mean that we could render icon and label here. And you also see React now starts complaining because we're rendering something that it thinks is not a React component because it doesn't have an uppercase letter. So now we can remap this to icon with a capital I and then use that as a valid React component. So next is also make sure that we render it as a flex, so it aligns them next to each other. And we can add a span around our label, so we can give it a margin left. Let's see what that margin should be. 12 pixels, so that gives us a class name of margin left 3. And then we also need to see the padding, because I gave it the padding of 5, but it actually should be padding of 5 only on the x-axis. And then they give a fixed height of 46 pixels to the buttons themselves. So that makes 4.6 REM in our case. And doing that already shows us that our component is kind of coming to life. And for now, we can still see the text. And it looks almost like it's lying on top of our command bar, but it's actually underneath it. But since our command bar has a transparent background, you can still see it. So in a second, we will also fade out the text behind the command bar once the command bar itself is active. But first, we have to finish the styling of this component. First, adding items center makes both the text and the icons align properly. Next, we should also add the hover state to our button. So we already have some interactivity. And you can easily find the hover styles by going to the element you want to hover, and then click this :hov, which opens a menu where you can select the forced hover state. And if you do that, you already see that we get the hover styles. And this again is a transparent white of 0.05. So we're gonna add hover bg white /005. So this way, if we write it properly, we get our hover states. You also see that the buttons are not full width, which they should be. So let's also add that in. And also make sure that the button wrapper is a full width. And then we already have a hover state for the buttons. I guess they also add an animation to that. And now we're at this point. I think it's nice if we could also have the text fade out and add this enable disable state, because that way it's again a bit easier to see what we're looking at. So if we look at Linear's website, you see that if we focus the input or if we click anywhere else on this component, that it focuses itself. And as soon as you click anywhere else, it closes again. So let's add the first interactivity to replicate this. What we need at first is have a ref, so we have a handle to our current command menu element in the DOM. So we can do that by adding const command menu ref is useRef, and that ref will set on our div. What you also see pops up on the left side is that we're currently using ref, but that's only available in a client component. So that means that we also need to add use client to the top of our component. And the only reason is because we are using the next app directory. Otherwise, this wouldn't be an issue at all. After we've done that, we should add an effect. And that effect only runs on mount. And what it does is it adds an event listener of click. And in there, we will check if the user clicked inside or outside the command bar, and based on that toggle its state. So let's create a function called toggle command menu that indeed gets a keyboard event. And in there, we create a variable that's called const clicked outside. And then Copilot is already suggesting something that almost looks okay. Because what we're doing here is we're checking if the element we're currently clicking, if that is inside our command menu div. If it is inside, we know that we did not click outside. So actually, this is currently reversed the suggestion Copilot did, because if the target is not inside our command menu, then we know we clicked outside. So let's create a state called opened and set opened, which by default is false. And then based on this value, we can set this state. So this way we can set the opened value. And we could, of course, add in here if they did not click outside. This would work, but it's also a little bit confusing, I think. So in my opinion, I would make it a little bit more explicit and say if the user clicked outside, then it's closed. And if they did not click outside, then it's opened. In my opinion, this reads so much more naturally than directly putting in here not clicked outside. But of course, code is all about opinions, and you should definitely go your own way here. This function then should be added into our window event listener. And of course, TypeScript is complaining because it's getting a mouse event and not a keyboard event. So don't always listen to AI because they're not always right. It's indeed a mouse event. And now TypeScript is also happy. What we also still need to do is return an unmount function that removes this event listener. And that's also the sole reason I added this as a separate variable, because if you would use an anonymous function right in here and also try to remove that event listener, then it would not have a reference to the anonymous function you created on this line. So you need to make a separate variable. So this function remains the same as the value that's passed into the register of the event listener as well as the removing of the event listener. So let's see if we can do something with this variable. First, add in the class names package again. So we can add a custom class name. And then let's, for fun, say if it's opened, then we're gonna add background of red. And if we then click the menu bar, we see that it becomes red. And if we click outside, the red is gone again. So now that works, let's add the proper styling. Looking again at Linear's website, we see that they add a transform of 128 pixels to the bottom instead of putting it in the center once it's not opened. So we can add another row in here that says not opened. And in there we add the translate Y of 12.8 rem, and then take out the existing translate Y we already had and move that into the open state. So doing that should already, like you see, position our element further down. And when we click it, it moves up again. The only thing is, it looks like it's positioned way too far down. Wait, they are actually applying this 128 as a default. So we can do that as well. But then I noticed that they use the focus within selector, probably because this input, it's not focused, but I guess there's something else that's focused, the button. And as soon as that has focus, they apply 24 pixels from the top. So we can remove this and add 2.4 rem, but that probably also means that we need to remove the top 50% as well. And now, of course, I reversed it, 2.4 and 12.8. And then if you click it, you see that it jumps right into place. And what also still needs to happen is the opacity change. Because default, it has an opacity of 0.6, and when the focus is there, it has an opacity of 1. So opacity 100 and opacity 60. So that way also you see that the opacity now also works. So that also fixes the opacity. Now the only thing left is adding in that animation. We can do that by adding transform. We can do that by adding transition, transform as well as opacity, which adds the default Tailwind transition to this element. However, it looks already pretty similar to what Linear created. So I'm not going to add any custom animation declarations for this. And now I also finally want to get rid of this text that is visible behind the command bar. And for that, I'm going to try to add a class name called opened when this element is opened. And then I'm actually going to swap these two around and add a div around our main text. This has still exactly the same result. However, what we can do is add a class name and then use an arbitrary value selector that says .opened plus ampersand. For now, I'm going to make it hidden so you see what happens. You see that it disappears. Because the way you should read this selector is ampersand is actually replaced with an identifier for this element itself. So let's say that class name would be .thisElement. What this then generates is a class name that looks like .opened plus this element. What this then does is it looks for a class name opened that has a direct sibling, this element. And once that's found, it will apply this Tailwind clause. So in this case, it applies the hidden clause. And via that way, we can pretty easily show or hide this component. However, because of the way we've written this CSS, since the plus is at the end, that also means that the text should be after our command menu, because the thing that's lost is what gets the styles applied. So the only thing we should still do is change this hidden to opacity 0 and also make sure that we add a transition to the opacity. And then you see that this text now fades out properly. So now let's finally make this command bar change options when you click one of them. First, I'm going to add a selected option as well as set selected option in the state. And that selected option will contain the index of the current option that's selected or null. If it's null, it will show all of the root level options. And if it's a number, it will show the options of that specific item. And to make it a little bit easier to know which options we should render, I'm gonna add a const current options and use memo to memoize the current options based on the selected option. So that means that this memo takes in the selected option as a dependency. And in here, I want to get the const options. That is either if we have if selected option equals null, then that is the root level, like Copilot is suggesting. Then it equals the root command options. And in case selected option is a number, then we should get the sub options from a specific menu. And then we can simply return these options, because this way we will always return an array of objects that contains both a label as well as an icon. And depending on whether we are returning the root level element or a child element, it will also have a sub options object. The only thing is, TypeScript still does not know for sure that there is a sub options object that can be returned from this memo. And there's multiple options to fix this. We could, for example, configure our own interface. And the problem doesn't necessarily lie in this piece of code. It's mainly in the construction of this object. TypeScript doesn't know for sure what the structure of this object can be. It can change. So we could either write a custom interface for this variable, or we could add as const at the end of our declaration, and that will automatically create an interface that's really specific to this variable. TypeScript will now know that nothing about this object will change during runtime. And that makes it so that it knows exactly what interface or what type it is. And if we do that, we see that we can hover current options here as well, and it also has exactly the same type. And now we've done that, we can also destructure sub options from here. And based on that, if there is a sub options, we should set the active index to the index of this option. And if there's no sub options, we know that we're clicking on a child element. And if we're clicking on a child element, we should set the selected option to null again. So one more thing we still need is the current index of the command. And we can get that simply by getting the index of the loop. First thing I also want to do now I'm at it is also add a key, which is equal to the label. And that key is simply something React needs to have when you map over something. Next to that, we can then add that on click. And I think it's fine to just define it in line here, since it's only used here and a rather simple function. Because what we can do is we can set selected option. And then if there is sub options, we set it to the index, and otherwise we set it to null. And I also see I made a little typo. It should be set selected option. And with that, if we now click an option, we should see And now we've done that, the only thing left is instead of always showing the root command options, we should show this new array of current options. And when we do that, we also see that TypeScript starts complaining that sub options is not always defined. And that's of course the case if we are already looking at a sub option. So TypeScript is warning us here that we cannot destructure it if it doesn't exist. So what we could do is, instead of immediately destructuring it, putting everything inside, using, for example, the rest parameter to catch everything that isn't destructured. And then we can say here if sub options in menu item. And via that way, we actually do almost the same check. We want to make sure that sub items is in menu item. And based on that, either return the index or null. And then TypeScript is also happy because now we do not destructure anything that doesn't exist. And if we now click an element, we see that it changes to the correct section. I only also noticed that it doesn't seem to correctly open and close the whole widget anymore. Let's see why that is. So what you see here is I did a little bit of debugging, and what you notice is it shows all of the elements clicked, and most of which are either the button or even the label within the button. So it is correctly tracking what you have clicked on. However, what I think is the case is that React is so quick in updating the DOM that this button is gone before our effect is run, because that's something that runs asynchronously, whereas the DOM is updated as fast as possible. So what happens here is that whenever we do the comparison, the button isn't in the DOM anymore. So this check returns false because it's not a child of our command menu anymore, simply because it isn't there anymore. So one option I can think of is if we give our button a unique class name, then we can either check if we clicked a command menu button. And if that's the case, we also don't close the menu. So let's do that and add a command menu button class name. And then we can go to our toggle command menu function and also add another variable here is menu button. And that checks if the e.target.classList contains the class command menu button. There is one extra check we need to add though, because the target of an event might not always be an element. So we should add e.target instance of element, because if we would not add this check, then TypeScript would tell us that class list might not exist because it could be something else than an element you clicked on. And with that, we can also check if you clicked on a button. So this check should then be added to the clicked outside, because if you did not click on a button and the node is not part of the current menu, only then you clicked outside. So now you see whenever you change an option that the menu stays open. But if you click on the text, it still doesn't work. And the reason is because the target element then is not the button, but is the span of the text label. And if the element stayed in the DOM, we could go to the parent node and see if that is a command button. But I think we can make this a little bit easier instead of complicating our code further. So what I want to do is remove this span. And instead of the margin left of 3, we add a gap of 3 to keep the space. But this way, even if you click the text, you're also clicking the button instead of a span, because there is no other label anymore. And only when you click outside, the menu closes. Beautiful. The only thing missing now is having that pop animation as well, or bounce animation as soon as you change an option. And for that, we first need to get this bounce animation, which is rather simple. And then next to the keyframes, also add in this bounce animation. And once we have done that, we should toggle this animation every time the selected option changes. So for that, we can add another use effect, which again as dependency has the selected option. And then in here, we can toggle the class list. We do, however, need to do this in 2 steps. So the first step is to get this ref.current, and if there is none, we return, because then there is no element we can manipulate. Otherwise, we're gonna get the ref again, .current.classlist, .remove, animate bounce. And this should of course be if there is no element. So first we remove the class, and then we actually need to trigger a browser reflow. Because if we immediately would remove and then add it again, you would not see an animation. We can trigger a reflow by, for example, reading the width from the document. So we can say command menu ref.current.client width. And after that, as soon as that reflow is triggered, we can add our animation class back. So if we copy this and then change it to add, then it toggles this animation. And now when we select an option, you should see this animation run. And that's right. You only see that it's moving to the far right edge, and that is because it's also removing the translate on the x-axis at the same time, because our animation does not contain that translate on the x-axis. And because we want to keep this animation as generic as possible, we also don't want to add this to that animation. So what would be the best next option to do this is add another wrapper div around our menu bar, and that is the element that scales down and scales up again. Whereas the next child, which is actually the absolute positioned menu bar, that's the element that has all of the other styles applied. So we could do that by adding a div around our command menu, and then also copy this ref to that div. Because now if we focus this element and change one of the options, you see that it bounces. But since there is no other translate applied to this element, it will not move to the right or the left, because that is applied to the child element. You only see that the text now doesn't fade out anymore, and that is because this open class is now on the child div instead of the root div. So that should actually be moved out to the wrapper div to make sure that that still works. And by doing that, the text also fades out again. And clicking now nicely bounces the options. Really, really nice. And I'm quickly looking at linear side again, and one thing we're still missing is that they always seem to highlight the first option. So let's also get those styles. Let's see what background it is. There's a background of white with 15% opacity. So we can add that to our button as well by adding first and then BG white 0.15. So this way, the first element is also always highlighted. There's a few more minor details that we still need to take over from Linear's website. The first one is this box shadow. So let's also copy that in. And we're gonna use this directly as an arbitrary value to prevent us from having to create another team config. And because we are using these arbitrary values, we should replace all spaces with underscores, because otherwise this would not be a valid class name. And that will immediately add the right drop shadow. Another thing I also notice is as soon as you select a subchild, it will close the menu for you. So that's also a small detail that we can still add. We can do that by inside our click handler checking if we clicked on a sub option or not, and if we did, close the menu. So I'm thinking of creating a new variable, const clicked root item, that equals sub options in menu item, because if we have sub items, we clicked on a root. So that replaces this check. And then we can add this check if we did not click on a root item, set open to false. And that will then close the navigation. But if we try this out, what you see is that the navigation always remains open. And the reason is because the click handler on our window is also fired. And that will then check if the menu should stay open or closed. So I think the best way to do this for now is to prevent the click event to bubble up to the window as soon as we want to close the navigation. Because all other options I will try to add, I think make this only more complicated. So what we could do is make this if, have curly brackets, and then import the event from our onClick and add stop propagation. And that will stop the click event to bubble upwards to the window. So in this case, if we did not click a root item and we want to close the navigation, we do that and also stop this click handler from ending up in our toggle command menu function. And this way we can focus our menu, click one item, it bounces but it stays, click another one and it closes. So that's exactly the behavior we want. And I think written in as least complicated way as possible. The only thing that probably makes sense is also to add a comment of why you do this. Because when someone else would encounter this code, it's absolutely not clear why this is happening. So let me quickly add that. So this comment says that we stop the propagation to prevent the click event from bubbling up to the window and triggering that toggle command menu function. And then the most important reason of why you add a comment, the why part, this function should be prevented because if the function ran, it would otherwise reopen the menu again. And then we could add because it registers a click inside the menu. Another small thing we still have to add is fixing this overflow. But of course, that's pretty easy by adding overflow hidden. So that way everything cuts off nicely. And then looking at Linear's website, there's probably two things missing still. No, three. First is responsive. That's something we're still gonna build. The other one is the search function. That is something that I'll probably add somewhere later this week, but not as part of this video because this video again already is pretty long and I don't want it to become way too long. So absolutely check the source if you also want to see how I built that. And not today, probably within a few days. But first quickly, let's have a look at how the responsive looks. And that will be the very last part of this video. If we look at our current version, we already see that it's pretty okay, but it needs a little offset on mobile, like we can see on Linear's website as well, like you see here. And we probably can do that by adding a small media query to our command menu. Because by default, we have left 50%, which should only count from medium and up. And then we can add a left with a calc of the 50% again, but then, for example, plus 7.5 REM. Because doing that offsets everything 75 pixels to the right from its center again. And then the other thing you see on Linear's website is that the navigation doesn't move up whenever you select an item. So that means that this 12.8 REM should always be applied when it's closed, but it should also be applied when it's opened on mobile. So that means that this 12.8 REM should also be added to the open state. And then with a media query, we change it to 2.4 REM on medium and up. And that way, if you click any of these items on mobile, it won't open anymore. You do, however, still see that the text fades out. So that's also something we should put behind the media query, which we can add in here as well. And that was the very last bit of our command menu. Like I said a few minutes ago, I will probably make this filtering still work within a few days. But for now, this wraps up this part of the video because the command menu already was quite a big portion of the video again. But for now, this wraps up this part of the video because the command menu again was quite a big component with a lot of details and a lot of things to talk through. I really hope you liked this video. Please leave a like, a comment would be even better, and definitely subscribe to this channel because it helps me a lot. And definitely check all of the links in the description to see what we've built, check the code, and also see a link to my Discord channel. I hope to see you in the next one.